All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is David Livingston, and I'm the Deputy Director for Advanced Energy and Climate here at the Atlantic Council. We very much appreciate you coming, and we'd also like to give thanks to our incredibly talented and dedicated team in the Global Energy Center who's responsible for putting all of this together today. It's a pleasure to welcome you today for a discussion on energy transitions, the role of oil companies in the energy transformation, and the future of offshore wind here in the United States and around the world. I will give a few contextual remarks, then hand off to our special guest, Mr. Brostrøm, for a brief address, to be followed by a fireside chat with the chairman of the Global Energy Center, Richard Morningstar, who needs no introduction. First, briefly on Ørsted. Ørsted, which we have the pleasure of hosting here today, was founded in 1972 as Danish Oil and Natural Gas to manage Denmark's oil and natural gas assets in the North Sea. It's since expanded operations to include oil and gas exploration and production in the North and Barents Sea. Ørsted's first foray into offshore wind was in fact the construction of the Vindeby offshore wind farm in 1991, which operated successfully until its decommissioning last year at the end of its design life. From that time, 1991, through to the present, today, Ørsted has been gradually transforming itself from an oil and gas company to a modern international clean energy company. But this event today is also the story of the transformation of the wind sector itself, transforming from a promising novelty many years ago to what is today an affordable mainstay that is only set to grow its share of the future energy mix. Brand new data released only this morning shows that offshore wind capacity increased from 14.4 gigawatts at the end of 2016 to around 17.7 gigawatts by end of 2017. This represents a growth rate of about 23% year on year. Indeed, rapid recent shifts in U.S. perception of the potential of offshore wind have been driven in large part by the stunning recent European offshore wind price declines, which include, just last year in 2017, a number of zero-subsidy bids in Germany and Holland. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management here in the United States has awarded 12 leases for offshore wind development all along the eastern seaboard from North Carolina to Massachusetts, for a total seabed area of 1.3 million acres, capable of supporting 14 gigawatts of electricity, roughly the equivalent of 10 to 14 nuclear power plants. With the results of North America's first major offshore wind auction in history, in which Ørsted is bidding, to be announced in May, it is an opportune time to hear from Thomas Brostrøm, President of Ørsted North America. You have Mr. Brostrøm's full biography in front of you in the materials for today's event, but I will note that he oversees all of Ørsted's North American operations, including offshore wind development projects in Massachusetts and New Jersey. He was recently elected to the American Wind Energy Association's Board of Directors and was named one of Boston Business Journal's 40 Under 40 recipients. And so, without further ado, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Mr. Thomas Brostrøm and to welcome him to this stage.
Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure being here today, and thank you for hosting me and inviting Ørsted to come here and talk about the transition we've been going through over the last 10, 15 years, but even more importantly also what we're doing in offshore wind and what we're doing with offshore wind here in the US. I want to thank Ambassador Morningstar for hosting me on this chat or panel afterwards. As you said, I'm heading up Ørsted here in North America, and I'll start out by saying that I've been with the company when it was called Dong Energy for almost 10 years. So I've seen a lot in terms of the transition we've been going through, and whereas it's sometimes hard to see what actually is going on because you sit there with day-to-day activities, when we look back in hindsight now, it's a quite remarkable transition we've been through. So let me just start a little bit and give you a little bit of context on who we are. So David mentioned it, Danish oil and natural gas, and when you put that together, that gives you this funny name, Dong Energy, and we've been all about oil and gas for many, many years. But we basically took a quite dramatic decision some 10 years ago to start to look more into renewables. So I'll give a little bit of context on what we saw at that point in time, and then obviously talk more about where we see offshore wind is today. But I think when you look back basically 10, 12 years, you were in a situation basically where we were seeing oil and gas prices dropping quite dramatically, not least because the US increased their production. And at the same time, we were focused on the North Sea, and it was getting harder and harder to actually find new resources. So when you look at it from both angles, that's not a great combination or combo here, where your earnings are increasingly under pressure because your revenue is under pressure, but at the same time, your growth perspectives are also under pressure because it gets harder and harder to find new resources. So we were starting obviously to look what could be alternatives here. And then I would point out that being largely a Danish company at that point in time, there were also a very large demand from citizens, from our customers, that they want increasingly more green solutions. So we were starting to look into what could we then see ahead of us. And that brings me a little bit back to offshore wind. And maybe let me back up just for a while, for a second. Dong Energy was essentially a result of a large merger that took place in 2006. 6 companies basically coming together. So you had all sort of assets suddenly sitting together under one roof, but common for it was all based more or less on fossil fuels. Coal-fired power plants, oil and gas. But we had, through the merger, suddenly acquired a couple of offshore wind projects. David mentioned the first project, Vindeby, built all the way back 27 years ago, and a couple of others. And we're starting to have engineers who had some competences within offshore wind. So we were starting gradually to invest more and more into this field here. And suddenly, over time, we have built basically world-leading competences. So I think when we sort of look back, you also got direction from the top. We are back in 2000, I think 6, 7 again. When we look at our energy mix, 85% of what we're producing were CO2 emitting, and 15% was clean. And we basically said we want to reverse that. So in one generation, defined as 2040, we want to have only 15% coming from fossil fuels. That's a very easy commitment to do, I think, because 2040, who cares? But it started to set a direction here for people that you're going more and more into renewable world. Then what happens is that in 2012, 2014, the financial crisis hit, and we're in the midst of transforming ourselves, but we have no money. So you're under pressure again, that you need money to follow through on your transformation here. And what we did essentially was to go out and create a little bit of fuss in Denmark, but we went out, asked the capital markets basically for an injection of something like $2 billion to basically continue the journey from black to green. And I'm very happy, because I want to get to our chat here, to announce that actually today we have been coming out with our first quarter results for 2018. And just a couple of numbers here. We have basically increased our renewable part of our production from, I think, 54% to 68% from first quarter of 2017. So up another 14%. And we've delivered the best result in the history of the company again. So we're certainly on the right track here. Before I let the ambassador come up here, I want to mention that we are right now expanding very heavily in offshore wind. And we have, since the first project in 91, built 23 offshore wind projects. And in 2015, I moved over here, and we've set up shop in Boston to do offshore wind in the US. We've been following it. We've been monitoring for many years. We've always could see that the potential is here because the physical conditions are great. So the strong wind speeds, especially in the northeast corner, and the shallow water depths are ideal for what we need for offshore wind conditions. But we felt the timing was right. So the last 3 years, we have acquired 2 leases, one 15 miles south of Martha's Vineyard and one off the coast of Atlantic City, New Jersey. We're also building on a contract a small project for Dominion in Virginia, 24 miles offshore. And we are pursuing other opportunities as we speak. So we are very bullish, I should say, about the U.S. Prospects for offshore wind, and we are investing aggressively into the market here. We are still a relatively small team, but it's grown to 40 people, based in Boston, but also we have set up offices in Atlantic City, in Richmond, even out in California. So I think with that, I just want to say that we think, basically, when we look at the market, we think you see the first project coming in of large scale in the early 2020s, and we do see a rapid growth where we feel it's very likely you'll see anything between 8 and 12 gigawatts by 2030, and from there on increasing even further. I think I will pause there, and then I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Thomas, and I'd also like to welcome everybody here on behalf of the Global Energy Center. I'm not totally sure why we call this a fireside chat. No fire, I hope. But in any event, you get the idea. Also, I hope that nobody noticed, but I will point out anyway, that David and I are wearing the exact same ties, and it's very random. We both got them from Sarah, Dan Jurgen's organization, and it's sort of an all-of-the-above energy tie. There are like windmills and oil rigs and transmission lines and all sorts of wonderful things on it. But now, to more important things. And I also should say it's a particular pleasure to have you here, Thomas, because I'm from Massachusetts, as many of you know, so you're now sort of a Danish Massachusettsian, and from what I understand, your daughters are now full-fledged Americans. So, let me ask you this as an initial question. Ørsted made the transition from an oil and gas company in Denmark to primarily a renewable energy company. I would suspect that in a country like Denmark with a lot of wind and a smaller country and with a state-owned company, that although I'm sure it was very difficult, may be easier than what other companies might be able to do. So I would ask you, from your experience with Ørsted, how does that translate to larger companies, large international energy companies, for example, who are looking to the future and need to have a company that is receptive or is takes into account future change? What kind of lessons from your experience might apply or not apply?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I do agree that it might have been helpful to be state-owned when you transform or transition a company like ours. But I really want to say that what our company did was looking ahead, took a long-term perspective, saying we believe that the world will run on more clean energy. And if you look at the energy mix in the world and in the US it's like 10% is renewable as we speak, 90% is still fossil fuels. We are quite certain, based on a number of things, obviously climate change, but certainly also where costs are coming down, that you'll see more and more renewables come into the mix. So we took a view saying rather go early than wait, because at some point you need to make that call, we think. So we rather come out early and find our niches, and our niche happened to be offshore wind because we've gained some expertise there. When I compare that to maybe large oil and gas majors here, I don't think it's that different, because obviously you need now to start looking into R&D, but also have some seed here and there where you can find the opportunities down the road. But you need to start now, and you will have, I think, the capital base to do that. When you look at your companies, you might find you have certain areas where you have some special expertise, and that's probably where you want to start. So the difficulty is that you will always have a period where you still need to obviously make money and make your shareholders happy. And that might be a period of time where, as you go through the transition, you need to be a little bit patient. And I think that's back to, we probably were a little bit fortunate that we had a patient ownership, which was, at least the majority was the Danish state.
And you know, one of the major, what we keep hearing is that there's such a great future for wind and solar because the cost per kilowatt hour has dropped so much. What are you finding with respect to costs of infrastructure, and how does that affect for companies the cost equation from the standpoint of really focusing more on wind or solar for that matter? What kind of infrastructure problems are there, and how much of a hindrance might that be?
Yeah, I don't think it's any secret that energy is regional, as I see it. And when you look at your energy infrastructure, obviously cost is important, the affordability, but reliability is another thing that's very important. You want to make sure the lights are on. I think sustainability is becoming increasingly more important. You want to be more green. I think the fourth perspective here is probably energy independence or energy security. So my point is, yes, when you look to transmission, you could probably, in an ideal world, combine regions in a more efficient way. And my example is often that if you were to combine in Europe, Norway with the UK, with continental Europe, you could get the benefits of efficient hydro from Scandinavia, combined with efficient offshore wind from the UK, combined with what you have in continental Europe. That would make a lot of sense. The problem is sometimes to get those transmission lines agreed between different nations is very hard. I would add that when we talk offshore wind and the cost we've seen, the cost reductions, which is quite remarkable. Back in 2007, you're talking just above $200 per megawatt hour, to basically last year when we saw that drop to in the 50s. And now we announced subsidy-free bids in Germany. That's a remarkable cost reduction. And those costs are basically including the transmission costs as well into the grid.
What do you do in Denmark? How do you handle backup generation if the wind isn't blowing? And what kind of infrastructure do you need for that? And is it easier to do what you're doing in a country like Denmark than, say, in Massachusetts or New England, which has a much more complicated infrastructure situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's no doubt when you start to increase renewable penetration, it has impacts on your system. There'll be price suppression because the wind is free, and that would reduce prices. But also when you talk about capacity factors, and that basically means how much is the actual capacity compared to the nameplate. And renewable is intermittent. So if you have a 100 megawatt wind farm, it will on average maybe produce 40 or 50 megawatt. And that has some issues for the system. I guess my point is that you can get that kind of base load result by having a diversified portfolio. So I believe when you look again to Denmark, you have 45% wind in the system, very reliable system, lights are always on. That works well because you have wind backed up with hydro coming from Scandinavia, and then you have an interconnector also to Germany. So you can still get the same effects. Obviously, I think you probably want to look at your grid and your, especially here in the US, I do agree with people saying, including the existing administration, that you need to invest in your infrastructure, because I think it's not up to date. And as you increase renewables, you're also putting pressure on the grid. So you need to see more investments into that. And then I think with time, and that's an area we are starting to invest more into, storage, whether that's battery systems, will obviously help that. And that's an emerging technology that is becoming more and more efficient, and that could also, I think, help with increasing penetration of renewables in the system.
And a place like Massachusetts, if it is more complicated, let's say, if it is more complicated than, say, Denmark, and to really make effective what you're trying to do, that there needs to be some new infrastructure, transmission lines, whatever. Who pays for that? Is that Ørsted? Is that the utility companies? Is it the ratepayer ultimately? How does that work?
I mean, ultimately it will be the ratepayer that pays for the energy. But the system in New England is, and then for offshore wind at least, we would be building the generating assets, but also the transmission assets offshore into the connection point onshore. That will be in basically our proposal, the bids we have in right now. Then what happens from the connection point onshore and into the system, that's normally the utilities who are responsible for that.
All right. You know, there was a lot of, I live on Buzzards Bay, so I never looked out really on windmills, but it's obviously been a big issue where even environmentalists, and our late Senator Ted Kennedy, were not terribly happy with the original wind farms being proposed pretty close to the coast. You were saying that your facilities are 50 miles offshore. How practical is that? It certainly solves the aesthetic problem, but how much sense is it making to have it that far offshore, and how is it working?
Yeah. No, I think to your point, and there's a project here that you're kind of talking about that didn't go ahead. It is a pristine area when you are in that part of the world. So I think what has been done now, moving the project, not 50 but 15 miles from shore.
I misheard, sorry.
That avoids sort of the visual impacts, which I think is important. That said, it's not that long of a cable distance, so you're probably talking 40, 50, 60 miles of cable, which is not that bad. What it does when you get a little bit further from shore is also you get the higher wind speeds. So it's kind of a zero-sum game and moving a little bit further from shore because you capture the better wind speeds, but you have a longer cable route to connect.
So the electricity is generated offshore, goes into the cable, and then connects onshore when it becomes the utility's responsibility.
Yes. So you have the wind turbines, and they will basically connect into an offshore platform or substation, and from that you will use export cables basically connecting into the onshore platform and the grid.
I'll ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. Having been a veteran of working many years in Massachusetts, what's been your regulatory experience in dealing with the Department of Public Utilities, in dealing with utility companies, and maybe more widespread outside of Massachusetts, but how has that worked? Eversource is my company where I buy energy from.
I think it's been an education journey from when we were starting to move over here in late 14 and early 15 to basically explain what has happened with offshore wind. And again, when you mention offshore wind in the early days, to some extent still now, people are thinking about Cape Wind and the projects that didn't go ahead and the people that were fighting it. When you come in and talk about actually a lot has happened over the last two and a half decades in Europe, where we've basically seen major countries like the UK and Germany move ahead, and the costs are not, what you think it is. We are into the single-digit numbers here. As a matter of fact, 2 years ago, we were cheaper than new-built nuclear. We were cheaper than gas in Europe. Then they start to listen a little bit, and when you start to say that we can move out, 15 miles out, it's great. Don't worry about visual impact. That gets the attention. So I think that has took took a little bit of time, but I think that understanding is there, and yes, there are facts to point to. To get through the whole regulatory process, I guess we haven't done that yet. So something I hope I look forward to, but I'll come back and tell my experience about it.
Yeah. I get 14 calls a day from people supposedly representing Eversource telling me how I can make choices in energy, and I'm sure most of the calls are scams, but in any event, I know what you're talking about. Let's open it up. I see Branko back there, Branko Terzic, who's one of our fellows and also a former commissioner of the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory
State
Commission.
Commissioner, so I've had some experience in licensing. Thomas, it wasn't clear what your business model is. You mentioned you have the engineering expertise to build these complex and sophisticated offshore. Is your model then to own and operate those, or would you rather build them for Dominion or somebody and then move on to the next project? What's the long-term strategy for your company?
Yeah, no, great question. So actually the project I referenced with Dominion is the first time we are building a project, albeit be a small project, for someone else. So our business model is very clear. We are developing our projects, which means we are securing the permits. You're doing all the offshore surveys to get wind data, to get seabed data, so you know how to design the wind farm. Then we construct the wind farms. Obviously, we procure all the components from Siemens and GE and Vestas and all the other suppliers. And then we operate them. So we run the wind farms for 25, 30, 35 years, the whole lifetime. And then we will also decommissioning them, basically removing them again, so you leave the seabed and as it were before, if you don't get to repower them. So we are long-term, you can say, player here. What we do, though, is in order to recycle capital to grow our business, we go out basically when we have de-risked the projects, which means you have secured the permits and the contracts, and you have normally also built the projects. Then you go out to, could be financial players who would like to have a non-correlated return, and they could get that from a 30-year exposure to an offshore wind farm. So that's why we are inviting in investors at that point in time. We would, in most cases, remain in as a 50.1% shareholder.
David? People have to start thinking of questions back there, because I might start calling on people.
It made some news, I believe it was last month, when LNG cargoes that it turned out were originally, purchased from Russia, or they contained some Russian volumes, landed on Massachusetts shores and helped provide...
And downtown Boston, to be clear.
Downtown Boston, yeah. Right on American shores, at the same time that the United States was becoming a net LNG exporter. And I know it stimulated some debate within the Massachusetts energy and policy community over the right energy strategy going forward. You would seemingly sit on a pretty attractive story in that offshore wind and the offshore wind opportunity in Massachusetts can help, can help actually buffer, some of those higher prices and some of those kind of extreme situations that you encounter during, severe weather periods in the winter, et cetera. What sort of reception are you getting on messaging, which is also a little bit about energy security, not just purely about economics? And where do you see offshore wind playing?
Yeah, I think it's back to the point. There's been a period where you have to educate about the industry here. And one area is that can these machines actually withstand the harsh conditions out in the water? And the question is absolutely yes. We have had no issues whatsoever with our 23 wind farms, and so it can last those kind of harsh conditions. Then the other thing is reliability. As we talked about, yes, you will produce basically 50% of the time, so you can rely on wind. More than 90% of the time, the wind turbines are actually producing because you're offshore. There's always some wind. To your question, then there's I'm a big believer myself of having a diversified portfolio, and I'm a big believer of always having something that is your own, at least something you all can always turn to. How big that share is of your total portfolio, I don't know, but you want to have something. And I'll go back again to being Danish, the Denmark story about why would you not just get cheap hydro down from Sweden and Norway and get something cheap up from the Central Europe? Because you didn't even want to be dependent on your brothers in Norway and Sweden. You want to have your own resource that also create jobs, but you know you can always turn to. And that's back to the energy independence and energy security. So I think for Massachusetts, it's a good thing you have something there you can also turn to. If you get better offers in, you can take that, but at least you know you have always something you can turn to. And I think you see that increasingly becoming more and more important, that you want to have a little bit of control of the energy mix. Then there are parts of the world where you may not be blessed to the same extent with the resources, and you can be in a different situation. But I think Massachusetts and New England, if there's one resource they do have, then it's wind, and it's offshore a lot. Well, also onshore, but then you're back to the point that there's a lot of people there, and there can be NIMBYism and things like that to some extent. You get that, I think, to a less extent when you're offshore.
I see. I'm seeing a bunch of hands now. Okay, why don't we start with you, and then I'll go to Bob Eichord back there, and then on the other side of the room.
Okay, I'm Nils Malskar from the Danish Embassy. And just in your experience so far, which arguments or what combination of arguments work the best, both on a federal level and in Massachusetts? You're mentioning security, resiliency, renewability, the renewableness of your grid. Which do you see the most traction with?
So actually, I think the current administration, Secretary Sinke and his team has done a lot to help offshore wind. They are doing quite a lot to streamline permitting processes, which is an area that is a little bit more cumbersome here for many good reasons, because you have federal and you have states that need to work together. It's a new industry when we talk offshore wind, so you need to understand what you're dealing with. I think they've done well in trying to streamline that. What matters the most when we talk about the all of the above approach here? Obviously, cost is important, but I do think energy independence and that you also create local jobs, those things I think are important right now. We as a company we firmly believe that climate change is also happening, and that's in us, that we think we want to respond to that, and that's sort of the vision we also have, that we want to see more of that. I do think that matters, but I probably and also for the administration. But I think the other three areas I mentioned are probably bigger drivers right now.
It's interesting. Just to follow up, it's interesting that Secretary of Interior Zinke has stated that wind power should be part of America. U.S. achieving an energy dominant position. And just maybe to drill down a little further, most of the people in this room, I'm sure, are very unhappy of our plans to withdraw from Paris. And in your view, how important is that? Or is it really market forces that are going to really lower emissions? And the arguments that you were just saying, that wind, solar, other new technologies are going to create jobs and will be more or less carbon-free. Will that in the end dictate what really happens with respect to climate? And the message, conveying that message to Zinke and everybody else in the administration.
I do think that setting obviously the direction from the highest levels is always important, because it signals whether you are open for business or not. And I think they've been out saying, yes, they're open for business, but these are the things we are looking at. I think it's market driven, really, and I do think that it's if you look to the U.S., it's the states who really drive a lot of it, because right. They are responsible for a lot of their own energy policy, and we can see that also with some of the states we are working with, like Massachusetts, like New Jersey and New York. When you come out, set targets for renewable, you see that the industry, reacts to that. So it's a combination, but my view is that if costs are coming down and you get competitive, that ultimately is what is driving the market.
Bob Eichord, another one of our fellows and an expert in energy transformation.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Branko Terzik's comment a little bit. In terms of the financing of the projects and what the banks and financiers and yourself are looking at in terms of how to come up with the capital that's necessary for these installations. Are you looking at long-term PPAs, and if so, what term are you looking at? In a lot of states, of course, we have different models that are developing, and a lot of merchant finance renewables now too. And then I guess the other aspect is in the U.S. environment. Obviously, we still have the solar and wind production credits. And so how important is that in terms of your decisions in the U.S.?
Maybe starting with the last part of your question. So the tax credits that are still here but being phased out here over the next few years are important to what you do, because it is some kind of federal rebate, you can argue. So that basically helps when you need to compete here. I don't think they we will continue without them, but right now they're very helpful. How we finance our projects, so on the PPA side, right now it's 15 to 20 years PPAs that at least the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has been asking for. We do like long-term contracts because of the visibility and certainty it provides. But we've also seen in other markets like Germany, where we've gone in and bid what is called zero subsidy bids, where you bid into the wholesale markets. Obviously, there's a lot more risk to that, because you're basically bidding a little bit on the wholesale market price, how that is evolving. When you have to finance yourself, you got to add a risk premium to that. So if you can do it on long-term contracts, you can avoid a risk premium and you can finance yourself cheaper. We have the benefit of having a fairly solid corporate balance sheet, so we will go out using our corporate balance sheet so we can push the button, and then we go out finance. We don't have to go out finding syndicates to do complicated project financing. There might be something we will do at some point, or we always consider, but right now we have the benefit of using our strong corporate balance sheet.
What kind of market are you finding in the U.S.? What's your competition? Are you in a position now that you're jumping in early and you're able to gain licenses because there isn't much competition, or is it a very competitive market? Assumedly, it'll become more competitive.
Yeah, no, it's. I think it's fair. When we moved in early 15, it was more or less a complete dead market, and it's reflecting the price that was paid for these leases, which were very, very low and below $1 million. Then you maybe saw an auction coming here in New York for lease areas where one of our peers here, Statoil, bought it at I think $40 million. Obviously reflecting that the market had moved a lot in that year. So when I look at the competitive landscape, this industry is global, and when we are the global leader here, once we move into a market, it takes basically 2 weeks, and then you have everyone else lined up as well. And that's what we're seeing now. And if I sound a little arrogant, that's not my intention, but that's what has happened here and out in Asia as well. So you have a lot of competition here. Large infrastructure funds, utilities, oil and gas majors that are coming into this field now. So you got to compete, you got to stay sharp, you always want to stay ahead of the pack, and it's increasingly difficult, but it's one thing I can say with certainty: the competition is extremely fierce.
It's interesting, your comment earlier about your company being a state-owned, primarily a state-owned company, which may have made it easier. Statoil also moving into it, and they're still a majority state-owned company, which, it's interesting to see them moving in. Okay, we have some there were a couple of hands back there, and then we have a hand in front.
Hi, Gil Jenkins with the American Council on Renewable Energy. 2 questions for you. One, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm interested in Ørsted's experience with an important constituent group for you in New England, the fishing community. It's my understanding that some of the misnomers are that sort of the fishing community is against offshore wind, but in some of the first examples we saw with the competitor's project, Block Island, in fact, the fishing is great around these turbines, and you're actually seeing that that's a constituency group that has come out strongly from offshore. I'm just wondering if that experience rings true for you all. and your work around the vineyard. Second question, I'm also interested beyond Massachusetts. Big news in New Jersey a few weeks ago with the bill passing to increase our renewable portfolio standard. How do you see offshore playing in there? And beyond New Jersey, what other markets are you looking at? Is it sort of the Carolinas and alike, and that sort of
California.
Two very great questions. I mean, the first question on the fisheries, and that's a very sensitive topic because obviously we are two different industries who want to harvest the ocean in a sustainable ways that somehow need to find a way that they can coexist. We have, number one, always been able to coexist with fishermen in Europe. I think when we look to the area around our projects in the New Bedford region, it's a very strong fishing community and obviously a strong industry. So it's about coming out very, very early and engaged and basically on both sides talk about what are the plans, timeline, design, what can we do to mitigate the worst areas, or where there's most fish, and what are sort of the routes you need to go in and out from. I will add that I think actually the federal has done a great job when they were sort of pre-qualifying these big tracks out there to avoid the most fished areas. So that's de-risked. But for us, it's just an area where that is a continuous discussion, and ultimately you want to find a solution that works for both. The problem is not so much when the turbines have been built and are spinning, because you're right, these structures create these artificial reefs, and that's been well documented, and it's evidenced that it attracts marine life and fish. And you can go in now because the spacing between turbines are getting increasingly wider, so you probably have a kilometer or more, so there's plenty of room to go in between turbines. It's more in the period where you have to go out doing surveys, when fishermen have to remove their gear, and when you are doing the construction. That's where you need to find some kind of solution.
Is there any water temperature issue around these windmills, wind farms?
Well, it gets cold, but not. I don't think there's any particular issue.
It doesn't raise the water temperature or anything like that?
Oh, no. And the second question about how to see the market. So I think it's starting where it should start, because you have the strongest wind speeds and also the highest electricity cost, I think, up in the north. As you move further down, the wind speed takes a little off, but it gets also a little shallower, which is good. So your structures don't have to be as massive. So I think anything between the Carolinas up to Massachusetts, maybe into Maine. That's where you're going to see the market in the first wave here. I do think when we look at it, we see New England, New York, New Jersey, and down to Virginia for sure, all being able to do multiple gigawatts of offshore wind, some more than others. Long term, well, not even long term, but if you go to the West Coast, obviously California is a very interesting market. It's deep, so it's floating structures. It's different, it's a bit more expensive, and something that, for instance, Statoil is investing a lot into. I think that's happening, and you will see floating structures at some point also being commercially feasible.
Okay, we have about 7 more minutes. Let's take 2 or 3 questions, and then Thomas will answer those.
Anders Pedersen, you touched briefly on the aspects of the procurement side, and obviously manufacturing has been a big piece of the puzzle when states are deciding on this. Could you say a little bit about, the margins are pretty tight for wind turbine manufacturers. How does that look looking ahead towards having production based not only in the US but in Europe compared to some of the Asian competitors?
Yeah, no, I think we have an aligned interest in that there is an extra cost of shipping components over the pond, if you will, and the production of wind turbines are taking place, offshore wind turbines are taking place in Europe these days. So when you have the right volume, the right market visibility, you're definitely going to see these big OEMs set up shop here. When that time is, I think that depends on the next few years how much how big the market will be. And you can just look to onshore wind, right? The first, 5, 10, 15 years, land-based wind here were also in that situation where most of the components, I think, were largely manufactured in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. And then you saw everybody setting up their business here in the, I think, 90s and the 2000s. So that's what we also expecting and hoping will happen here. On the margins, it's getting, more mainstream technology, which that's what we're hoping for, that the industry is that mature. And I think we all see that that competitive nature of things right now between developers needing to compete hard, putting pressure on your returns. The same things happen in the supply chain. But I do think that the growth you're seeing right now, globally you're at, I think, 17, 18 gigawatt, 17. And by 2020, we can just see with all the investments being made and the construction going on, you are closer to, I think, 30 gigawatt. And when you look out to 2030, taken in Asia, you are, I think, at 100 to 120 gigawatt. And what that does, obviously, is that it creates an industry where you get volume, standardizations, and basically what happens in any other big industry like the car industry, that puts pressure down on your supply, but maybe also on your margins.
Okay, let's have a couple of questions before you answer, and then we'll see where we are time-wise. Cynthia Quarterman, another one of our fellows.
Yes, and I ran the offshore program here in the United States in the late 90s when Cape Wind came in, and probably was the first person to testify about before Senator Kennedy and others about the issues there. So I congratulate you on your presence of mind to headquarter your company in Boston and wish you well on that Nantucket project. My question is, do you think that the offshore oil and gas companies have an advantage in having been offshore to operate some of these big wind projects? And secondarily, is there a challenge for you in terms of the ports in the United States and getting in some of those big wind turbines?
What was the last question?
Is there a challenge for you in the U.S. in terms of the size of some of our ports for wind turbines coming in and that kind of thing?
Let's get another question. Weren't there no more hands? Do we have another? Yes. Why don't you stand up and tell us who you are?
Hi, I'm Alex Stapleton with the British Embassy here in D.C. You talked a lot about Europe's lesson around cost and how that's important here in the U.S. and that's where you're getting a lot of traction. I'm wondering if you foresee the runway that Europe had and the UK had as a potential challenge in terms of managing expectations, and if so, how you're addressing it.
The runway?
Well, the market in Europe and the UK is a lot more mature. They've had a lot more time to bring down project costs. Is there a concern around overpromising in a pretty new market here in the US?
Why don't you go with those two questions, man?
Yeah, I'll start with the latter and come back to you if that's okay. Actually, I think it's a big benefit for the US that you can tap into what has happened over the last 20 years in Europe, in particular the last 3-4 years. I talked about the cost, right? You don't have to tap into a $200 project anymore. It's much lower. Are we over-promising? I certainly don't think so. And right now, we are one that put bids into that. We are fully behind. Are you going to see the same, cost as you see in Europe right now? Most likely not quite, but I think, it's the same components you have here. We talked about the same conditions here. So what is sort of missing here is, a supply chain that needs to be built, and there's a little bit of an extra cost of part of that, but that's really it. And then I think you're hitting the right time, but there's so much capital, investment appetite right now for a lot of folks. That also means that the competitive nature, I think, is tough and fierce, which you'll benefit from here. So I'm not too concerned about over-promising, and the technology is phenomenal. I mean, it's gone from the 3-4 megawatt turbine a few years ago to the 6, 8, 9, 10 megawatt turbine today, and we believe that you saw the GE came out with a statement saying they would have a 12 megawatt turbine ready in a few years, and I'm sure that the two other big OEMs, Siemens and Vestas, would have something coming out as well. So I feel pretty comfortable on that. I wanted to quickly get back to your question, on the port side, you mentioned, is that a challenge here? And the answer is yes. You need investment into new ports. That is happening to some extent. In New Bedford, in Massachusetts, the state has invested a lot into that to make it more fit for offshore wind, which is great. But you also need more. You need a few more hubs. So you need, with time, also a Jones Act compliant vessel, and you need somebody to be able to build that. And to be able to handle those large components here, you need to have investments into the harbors and the ports. And that's something we are working with, as other developers are, with the right folks to make that happen.
Okay, I think we have another minute or two. There was a hand down in the front before. Yes, why don't you hold it, time out.
Oh, John Cook, consulting engineer from West Coast, San Francisco. What's the smallest unit you people would consider initiating, the smallest unit? And then how do you expand it economically?
It comes down to also what kind of, I mean, there's a lot of scale benefits when you build larger projects. If that's what your question, how big a project or how small a project would you do? Yeah, so I think, yeah, I think for us, offshore wind, because you have to go offshore and it's big vessels, it's kind of it's expensive if you don't only do a few units. So we have been seeing projects actually increase dramatically in size, and our view is that you would do offshore wind projects. You are in the hundreds of megawatts, and you're actually starting to go beyond 1,000 megawatts. So that's a lot. We are building a 2-turbine project, what we call a test project right now for Dominion. That makes sense for, I think, more testing purposes. It's too expensive to build 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 turbines. You want to go out to 40, 50 or more because you get the synergies and the large-scale benefits.
Okay, I don't want to cut anybody off. We've about reached the end of time. If anybody has a burning question, I guess not. Okay, this was great, and I think part of why it was great is that your answers were just so direct and succinct that it was really a terrific education, I think, for all of us. So I'd like to thank you for being here, for telling us what you're doing, and I hope everybody will give you a good round of applause.
Thank you.